We jumped into a series a few weeks ago on the book of Romans, AKA the believer's constitution, which answers for us the question how to get right with God. That statement, that question is a confession in itself. To get right with God acknowledges that we're wrong with God. How do we reconcile this relationship? And today we are going to be in Romans chapter 2, verse 17 through 29. So if you're new to the story, I'm going to try to summarize it as quickly as I can. Just know that the first two messages, I've completely failed my assignment. We think it's important for us as we are in this study to really track with Paul's train of thought, to stay with him logically so you understand his argument. It's really easy to get distracted by some of the buzzwords in the text, and so staying with Paul is key. And we do have to, we have to do a bit of a review and a summary. One, so all of us can carry forward what Paul wants us to keep in mind. And two, for our guests who are new to the study, you're going to hit the ground running with us. And Paul is ultimately the person writing the letter who was once an adversary to the church. Now he becomes an advocate of the church. He hated, followers of Christ, and he becomes a leader of followers of Christ. So if you hate Christianity, you have some strong thoughts about Christianity, you're going to love Paul. Paul becomes a renegade for the gospel. And that's ultimately what he is advocating and addressing here. And he's writing it to the Roman Empire. So he's writing this letter to the center of the known world. This is Paul's bold attempt to come knocking on the door of culture and society's greatest influence. And to say, hey, I want to speak into the matter and I want to engage in the conversation that is taking place at the epicenter of our world. More specifically, I want to address a church in that context. So Paul, this guy who is radically changed by Christ, who becomes a leader, is writing a letter to a church in Rome, in the center of the Roman Empire. He is engaging with the thinking of the day. Now, stay with me on this because it's important. It sounds weird to say these things, but Paul is engaging with the thinkings of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Zeno, who was the father of Stoicism, as well as other Stoics who would follow. That was the primer. It was the paradigms that shaped the way in which they viewed the world, understood meaning and reasoning. Logic was rooted in those influences. Still to this day, you can find their influence on the Western world all over the place. And so Paul is writing to that conversation. When you read the book of Romans, you have to read it as a debate. You have to read it as a debate. Paul is going to market with his beliefs. Paul has a righteous stubbornness. You want to know someone in your life who has a righteous stubbornness? You want to be thankful for that person who has a righteous stubbornness? Grandma, who is the only person who is anchored in conviction, anchored in values, who is a God-fearing woman in your family, who prayed for you daily, and though everyone else co-signed to your foolishness, it was grandma who was always there shaking a finger saying, God created you for more. I'm not going to stop believing in you. I know God has great things in store for you. Come on, show some love to grandma who just stood in the gap with some righteous stubbornness. Paul has some righteous stubbornness. It reminds me of the book of Ezekiel, which is a wild book. God says to the prophet, I'm sending you to a wicked people who are hard-headed. Therefore, I'm going to give you a forehead of flint. God is telling the prophet, I am going to make you even hard-headeder. Harder-headed? Any grammarians in the room? I'm just going to leave it alone. But I'm going to give you this righteous stubbornness, this forehead of flint. And Paul steps into a context where everyone is proud of their logic, proud of their reasoning, proud of their belief system, and says, okay, let's put all the cards on the table. I'm not socially embarrassed about this, and I am not intellectually embarrassed about this. And so Paul begins to engage with the culture about the gospel. He's addressing the culture and he's addressing this church, and he's doing so with the gospel. This church is a divided church. Anyone still think that still happens? Do churches still get divided? And this is a divided church. Jew and Gentile is the tension. Why is it divided? Well, the Emperor Claudius, before Nero, kicked all the Jews out of Rome. They had started a church there, started spreading the gospel. Now Claudius kicks them out. Emperor Nero takes power. He allows the Jews to return to Rome. The Jews return to Rome to discover their church still exists. In fact, the church is thriving and growing and doing well, but it is entirely Gentile. Different culture, different customs, different traditions, and now the Jewish believers show up, and there's a tension between them and the Gentile believers. So Paul is addressing the Roman Empire and a divided church, and he's drawing our attention to the gospel. He summarizes the gospel in 2 words: grace and peace. That peace is where we're going, grace is how we get there. Peace is the destination, grace is the vehicle. These 2 words are critical, and their order is also important. So he says, I'm going to tell you this good news, and I am unashamed about it. That there is an abundance of grace provided to us through Jesus Christ, and it leads us into a peace that surpasses understanding. A multifaceted, multi-layered peace that comes with peace with God, peace with your coworkers, as well as a peace of heart and a peace of mind. It is a robust idea of peace. And Paul says, I'm unashamed of this. Now, after saying I'm unashamed of this, he's saying, listen, I'm not socially or intellectually insecure here. He said the first thing that we have to understand is the wrath of God. Someone say, dun, 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 dun. Every time you read it, it feels like it calls for the soundtrack, because so many people are walking around with a caricature of God. Your view of God is that he's impulsive. Your view of God is that he's angry. Your view of God is that he loses his temper and that he is out to get you. You read scripture as a threat, and therefore you attach cruelty to his character. Paul's saying that's the wrong way of viewing it. This is not a threat, it's a warning. Therefore, you shouldn't attach cruelty to his character. You should attach love and care to his character. Paul is saying your understanding of wrath is completely wrong. The idea that Paul puts in front of us is every single one of us daily makes decisions, and we move in a direction that lands us in a destination. And he's saying you're leading a life that leads to the wrath of God. Heads up, you're going to be disappointed if you get there. The easiest way to understand the wrath of God, if you're new to Northview, is the wrath of God is giving you exactly what you want. The wrath of God is saying, okay, like, I will give you everything you've desired and tried to earn and produce your entire life. And that's good news. This God, Paul is saying, is incredibly fair. He's a just God. And so Paul is building his argument on 3 pillars: justice, logic, and truth. Folks, I know it's a lot. But what he's saying is, listen, we all have this sense of right and wrong, right? And he's saying that's the just part of our God. He can delineate right and wrong. And when you have an understanding of right and wrong, it produces a logical, rational way of thinking. You do away with right and wrong, and the framework of your reasoning begins to wobble. He's saying justice and logic, right and wrong, reasoning, rationale, they complement one another. And his verse in chapter 2, verse 2 is they are based on truth. Okay, so he's building this idea. It's based on truth that every single one of us is heading towards a moment where we're going to get exactly what we want. That God is going to say to you and I, thy will be done. You want a life without me? You want an eternity apart from me? Thy will be done. I would define that as hell. An eternity apart from me, separated from God. God's saying, yeah, when you arrive at that place, that's how you're going to view it. And The challenge and where Paul is so brilliant is, again, he's debating. And he builds his arguments easiest to hardest. You do the same thing. You walk into a debate in the living room, you go for the layup before you shoot a half-court shot. Like, you got to work up your confidence in that argument. Paul, he starts with the easiest argument, and then he builds it out to the harder argument. He says all of humanity at some point finds himself in three categories. The first category is the indifferent. The second category is the moral. And the third category is the religious. See, again, Paul is engaging with the philosophers and the Stoics, who all agreed that you and I should live in unison and in agreement with creation. That the foundation of morality is what is referred to as natural law. Embedded in humanity is a conscious and a moral awareness of some things are right and some things are wrong. And Paul is appealing to these great minds of human history, and he's saying, hey, on this first point, you agree with me. Plato, you agree with me. Socrates, you agree with me that we should live in agreement with creation and natural law. What he is saying is just consider one step further. If we all agree there's a natural law, is it that much of a leap for you and I to consider a lawgiver? Is it really that much of a leap for us to say behind all of this is someone who is brilliant? And there will be some people who live every single day of their life participating in natural law. Live every single day participating in the grand design of creation. You're gonna wake up and go to bed based on creation's timeline, creation's cycle. You are going to participate in life and function based on cycles and systems hardwired into our world. Does that make sense? Every single day you're engaging in it. If you woke up today and be like, you know what, I'm taking a break from oxygen. You're done. The moment you step out of this participation, you realize it gets pretty wobbly. And he's saying, yeah, there are people who will participate in God's grand design their entire life, every day of their life, and still arrive at a place, I just don't believe there's a God. Well, what Paul is saying is he's like, once you do that, things get really wobbly. For the person who says, I'm just gonna be indifferent, what you have to consider is the moment you do away with God, your belief system is really flimsy. If there is no God, you have no case for a moral lawgiver. You have no case for right and wrong, ethics and values. You have no case for truth and reasoning. You lose a lot. You lose a lot in terms of your view on death and life, as well as purpose and meaning, and any idea in terms of transcendence and eternity. So Paul begins, and he would have had the influencers of their culture nodding their head with him. Like, yeah, that doesn't make a ton of sense. We should be open to the fact that there's a lawgiver behind these laws. He said, but for some, they will look at this group and they will judge them, because for the moralist in the Roman Empire, they're like, no, we've got this fully figured out. We are living with values. We are living with morals. We don't need God. And he said, there's your problem. You are disillusioned by your own goodness. And scripture says our own righteousness is but filthy rags in comparison to God. And he is basically saying, you are a law unto yourselves. Every time you make a judgment call, every time you delineate something between right and wrong, every time you stand on what you believe to be true, you are a law unto yourself. Yeah, you don't have the Torah. You weren't raised in the temple. You weren't given all of this heritage of the faith, but you live every single day establishing a standard of right and wrong. And Paul says, and you too are going to get everything you deserve and earned and have wanted. Great news. Well, why don't we hear that as great news? Because beneath the veneer and the mask and all the ways in which we've gone around fooling other people, deep down inside, we know we don't live up to our own standards. Wait a second. If he's going to give me everything I have deserved, earned, and desired, I'm not going to be okay with the outcome. So Paul is taking a wrecking ball to the indifferent way of thinking, the moral way of thinking. And again, he's going easiest to hardest. And he lands at the end of chapter 2, and he's going to take a wrecking ball to the religious way of thinking. So for the person you're here, you're like, I don't like religion. You're going to love Paul. And there's something that I need to get to over here, so we'll leave some space for that. And we'll jump into the text and we'll go from there. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Romans chapter 2. How long did that take me? See how long it takes to just bring you up to speed? I'm trying my best here. Here we go. Verse 17. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know his will and approve what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have the law, the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then, who teach others, do you, not teach yourself. You who preach against stealing, do you steal? And you who say to people, you who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? And you who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law as it is written? Watch this next statement. For God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Because God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Paul is writing a letter to a church, to a group of religious people, and he's saying society and culture are mocking and scorning God because of something you're doing. Talk about a haymaker to the jaw. Have you ever looked at someone living out their faith and doing something that is bizarre and unproductive and a misrepresentation of God, and you think to yourself, people are unnecessarily scorning and mocking our God because of what you're doing? Wave at me if you've ever seen that in somebody. Yeah. The hardest place to see it is in the mirror. All week, as I've seen Christians, whether they're Republican or Democrat, black, white, brown, it does not matter, take to Facebook over this last week, I thought, Lord, would you help them see it in the mirror? He says, they serve the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. If those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, even though you have the written code and circumcision are a lawbreaker. I'm gonna read that one more time, that got clunky. The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who even though you have the written code and circumcision are a lawbreaker. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. So it's friend weekend and someone in your life said, hey, you have to come check out church. You're gonna love it. We're in the study of Romans. We just laid it out for the next 38 weeks. You're gonna think it's amazing. And then you show up and I read a text that says circumcision 7 times. It's a doozy. And here's what I'll say. If you have your young people with you, just take a deep breath. I'm totally gonna punt that one back to you, mom and dad. You will crush that conversation. You understand the metaphor. You'll see where it goes. But Paul is saying, okay, I've addressed the errors in their thinking. I've addressed the errors in their thinking, and you religious people, well, you love this right and wrong conversation. You love the debate. You love the comparison. You love the measuring up. Okay, well, let's play the religious game. Again, he's going to market with his beliefs. Let's talk right and wrong. And he says, okay, to the Jewish community, there's some things that you do have right. You have the right background. You have the right book. And you have the right business. Think about their background. Paul is writing to a divided church, Jew and Gentile. The Gentiles are just coming into the faith. They're new to this entire deal. And then here comes the Jewish community coming back to Rome. And now you have some professional Christians, some sophisticated people in terms of their religion. And Paul is saying, be careful you don't start looking down on people. Take into consideration your background. These people weren't raised in the Torah. They weren't raised in the temple. You have an amazing background. You were set up from day one. You are a descendant of Abraham. You have the law from Moses. You were raised in an education system. The entire Jewish education system centered on one text, God's text. By the ages 7 to 10, Jewish children would have the entire Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, completely memorized. You were set up from the very beginning. And not only do you have the Torah, you have the prophets. You have this remarkable legacy. The 10 commandments coming through Moses, the Exodus and liberation from Egypt and Pharaoh. You have the Red Sea experience. You have the Mount Sinai experience. You have so many things available to you that your background set you up for success. See, the religious group, and all of us Christians need to be mindful of this. We love to look down on these two groups. And we just don't take into consideration, for some of us, the background we were blessed to come up in. So for example, say you are a Christian and spiritually out of 8 out of 10, a 1 out of 10, you would rate yourself as an 8. And there's someone else in your life who is a 7 out of 10. And the fact that you are one ring above them in some way gasses you up and leads to a prideful ego. And what Paul's saying is like, yeah, you're an 8, but you started at a 7. The person you're looking down on is a 7, but they started at a 2. You're looking down on someone who's grown more than you. Who are you looking down on who's making tremendous strides in their faith, but you were just blessed with a background, blessed with wonderful parents, blessed to be raised in a church, blessed to be sent to a private school, blessed to be under mentorship and guidance your entire life, where by osmosis you were trained in the things of God. He said, okay, well, if that's the case, you should know better. He says, you have the right background, you have the right book. Again, you have a text that no one else had. You have this written code. And lastly, you have the right business, which that's the one that you're kind of slave to the alliteration. You need another letter that starts with B, or another word. But if you look at verse 19, he says, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, and a teacher of infants. These are things that were hardwired into the nation of Israel, that you are to live on mission as a representation of God in the world. God is going to use you as a guide for the blind and a light within the darkness. And the promise made to Abraham that the Jewish people would be a blessing to all people is the business that God wanted them to commit to. I just seen that deserves another S. You have the right business. But let's balance the ledger, Paul says. Where are you in the wrong? And you're in the wrong in terms of your practice, in terms of your prominence, and lastly, in terms of your perspective. He's saying you don't practice what you preach. This is why culture is scorning, mocking, and ridiculing the faith. Because like Christ, they too see the hypocrisy. It's the thing none of us want to talk about. I don't want to acknowledge my shortcomings and inconsistency as a follower of Christ just as much as you don't want to acknowledge yours. But Paul is saying there comes this tendency when you drift into just this mechanical approach to your spirituality that you reduce it to this religious system, that eventually it becomes hollow and it is empty practice that isn't consistent. Your behaviors don't align with your beliefs. You're not practicing what you preach. Are we practicing what we preach? Secondly, he says, you're wrong when it comes to your prominence. Because again, what Paul is doing is he is creating level ground at the foot of the cross right now. We come to the cross with a hierarchy in our mind. There's the indifferent, there's the moral, and then there's us, the religious. And Paul comes in and he knocks the whole thing out and he says, no, you're all on level ground at the foot of the cross. I gave you the mission as the Jewish people to showcase my glory, my prominence to the world, not yours. Not so you could be the center of attention, but so that I could be exalted and lifted up. And why do we do this? Because we're so performance-oriented in our thinking. We find much of our identity and our worth in our performance, and so we drift towards religion because it's very performance-based. Like a great exercise this week in your life group, you can do it as a family at the dinner table. Take a piece of paper and draw 6 boxes on it. And then go around, take 10 minutes, and draw stick figure portraits in those 6 boxes, and tell your life story in 6 images. Everyone just go around and take a few minutes to tell your life story. Now, here's what I add to the exercise. Do 6 images that tell your life story, but you can't use a single accomplishment. And watch how the identity in the room gets a little shaky. Who am I and what is my story outside of my accomplishments? You see how that works? Like, we find a lot of identity there. And so we fall into this performance, prominence, measuring up comparison. Paul's like, where you're wrong is you are comparing yourself to this person, when all of us should be comparing ourselves to this person. And then we all realize, oh, there's a chasm between all of us and God, level ground. And Paul says your perspective is off. That's where he talks about circumcision. And that's where he says you are one outwardly, but you're not one inwardly. In other words, he's saying you have a hollow faith. You know, I was reading this article about King Tut's coffin. You know, the things pastors read. And it says, as they found the coffin, they began to open it up, and it was this big gold-plated coffin. So they opened it up, and inside the gold-plated coffin was another gold-plated coffin. So they open up the second coffin, and inside that is a third gold-plated coffin. They open up the third one, and there is a gold-plated mask placed on the body. They pulled back the mask and the draping that was over the body, and do you know what they found? A bunch of dead bones. You didn't even see it coming, did you? I mean, so meticulous in adding layers upon layers of varnish, but beneath it all is just a bunch of dead bones. We do that all the time in religion. All kinds of layers of varnish hiding the reality that this has not been fully integrated into my life, where this knowledge of God has moved from my head to my heart and internally is shaping me from the inside out. And he says the whole idea, where's my marker? He says the whole idea about circumcision, the best way maybe we can relate to it would be baptism. He would say, in the same way baptism is a public proclamation of an inner transformation, right? It is an outward expression of an inward reality. My life has been radically changed and redeemed, marked by the grace of God. I identify with Christ as my Lord and Savior, who conquered death, hell, and the grave on my behalf. I'm with Jesus. This inward reality has moved me to stand publicly and let everyone know he's the theme of my life. If you're a Christian and you haven't been baptized, you should be baptized. If Christ is truly the theme of your life, well, then it should be nothing to stand publicly and let others know that. For the person who more so casually just jumps into baptism and does it as a fun experience but doesn't have the weight beneath it, has this outward expression of, hey, look what God's doing in my life, but they don't have the inward reality of that grace at work within them. And Paul is saying, you have to change your perspective on that. This has to move inwardly. So this is where there's an old book called The Critical Journey. Maybe a book to check out. I won't do it justice today. It breaks down kind of your stages of faith. And a lot of different people have taken a stab at doing it this way. I would not say I think this is infallible. This is just one way of looking at it. And so they call it the 6 stages of faith. And it would begin with recognition, then discipleship, then productive. I'm just going to use one word, but these are full statements. I'll put a picture of this out there. Then you have inward, outward, and you end with a life of love. Okay, let's try to jump into this quickly. What time do we have? So stage 1, where we all enter into our faith, is a recognition of God. Many of you, you're kind of wrestling with this idea, hey, does God exist? Is this real? I can't help but acknowledge the design. I'm participating in it every day. Is there like supreme being behind it all? We all come into this recognition of God, and that's the starting point of our faith journey. Now, some of us come into this in different ways. Again, some of you were raised in a godly home, and almost by osmosis, you were primed to be an early adopter of the faith. Yeah, I see it for what it is. Some people come to the faith by nature and creation. A lot of people have looked out at the world, looked at the mountains and the oceans and the stars and the sky, and thought to themselves, wow, there has to be an amazing maker. And that was their first recognition of God. Some people, they come into a recognition of God through a life crisis. You go through a divorce, you walk out of an abusive relationship, you lose your job, you get in a terminally ill medical report, you go through something catastrophic, your world is turned upside down, you're confused, you're isolated, you're lonely, and you're brokenhearted. You don't know what your options are. You don't know where to go. You don't know who to turn to. And a lot of people show up to church looking for an option. And it's in a space like this, in a crisis, that people discover, wait a second, this God truly does draw near to the brokenhearted. This God is always up to something, even when we're down to nothing. This God is redemptive and somehow works all things together for good. And this God extends mercy and peace, and his mercies are new every morning. And there's a supernatural strength that he extends to me. And he's surrounded me with godly people. And you start to be able to trace God's work in your life, and there comes a recognition of God. I showed up here at rock bottom, and I discovered he is the rock at the bottom. And I can stand upon him in my life. I recognize God. Well, from there, you go into the discipline of discipleship. The discipline of discipleship is for a season. You're learning, you're being taught, you are a student, which life is just better for all of us when we think like beginners rather than experts. And you go into the season where other people are, hey, this is what it means to be a Christian. This is the lifestyle, the values, the behaviors. This is what we identify ourselves with. Here's how we function as followers of Christ. There's like a discipleship learning student season that then produces the productive life. Jesus not only makes life better, he makes you better at life. If we were to wake up tomorrow to discover conclusively God does not exist and all this was nonsense, at this point, I would still subscribe to the Christian life. In my experience, I have found that Christianity is the best approach to marriage, the best approach to raising children, the best approach to enduring suffering, the best approach to gaining wisdom beyond your years, the best approach to discovering your identity and purpose, the best approach to creating harmonious community. It's the best approach. It's just the best approach. Now, without a doubt, I believe God is real. But you step into a season where you start to taste, see, and witness the productivity of God's work in your life. And here comes the challenge. Most people stop here. They stop there and they keep all that God is doing on the surface of their life. Remember, we're drawn towards performance. And so we have this productivity in our life and we just think that is sufficient. And Paul's saying, no, at some point it has to move inward and it has to be integrated into your life. It has to go beneath the surface. And here's the problem. And if you read The Critical Journey, and again, they've done great work. It's two individuals who completely deconstructed in their faith long before it was a vogue idea. And they capture their thoughts honestly. And in it, they say the breakdown is between stages 4 and 5, and they call it the wall. And they say most people break down before they break through. That as they are beginning to integrate this into their life, something happens. Their theology comes face to face with their psychology. How do I think about this? Okay, I came into the faith because I seen the sunset and I was moved by this idea of God. Okay, I came into the faith because those I trusted were wise and responsible with my life and they raised me in an environment that primed me to think this way. Oh, okay, I came into the faith because I went through a crisis and it was God's tender mercy that sustained me through that. But now as I begin to internalize this, I'm having a hard time reconciling my theology with my psychology. I have some questions. And what Paul is making the argument, folks, is he's saying, yeah, you shouldn't be afraid of your questions. Don't take the bait of culture and assume that just because you have an unanswered question means there's no answer. Paul's saying there is a sturdiness to this faith that you can lean heavily, narrowly, and pointed into your faith, and you will discover, wait a second, this is stronger than I thought. And his whole argument, and the reason why, is he says it's based on truth. That the more you get into this, the more valid you're going to discover the truth to be. And it makes me think of the final days of Jesus' life. I'll end with this, which is what a pastor says when there's anywhere from like 5 to 30 minutes left. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. In the beginning was the Word. I believe Jesus is the source of all logic, reasoning, wisdom, and truth. And we tend to think that this is the first time in human history that the truth has stood on trial. The truth has always stood on trial. In fact, Jesus in his final days went through 3 religious trials, 3 civil trials, a popular vote, as well as the scorning at the cross. He's arrested and he's drugged into the former high priest's home, Annas, who can't find any fault with the truth. So they drag him out of Annas' home and they take him to Caiaphas' home, who is the current, high priest. And once more, Caiaphas can't find any fault with the truth. What I love about it is Caiaphas actually breaks 7 laws while persecuting Christ. And it's amazing because in that moment, Christ is breaking the burden of the law upon the people of God. What's also brilliant about it is the priest had a practice during Passover that they would come together and they would all lay hands on the sacrifice to bless the sacrifice. And there at Caiaphas' home, the religious priests got together and they all punched and smacked and hit Jesus. And in a way that they couldn't see, God still had them blessing the sacrifice. It's so cool. And they can't find any fault with the truth. So then they place him in front of the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, again, can't find any truth until someone declares, hey, he said he's the Messiah. He said he's the one who was to come, who was to fulfill our law, our prophets, everything God has promised. And they are furious and they say, well, there it is. He's deserving of death. Literally, the ones who were teaching people to anticipate the arrival of the Messiah are standing in front of the Messiah, and he's like, yeah, I'm him. And they can't even see it. Religion can be blinding. They turn him over to Pontius Pilate, King Agrippa. He goes through 3 more trials. Pontius Pilate gets to a point where he's like, well, let's just let the public decide. We'll give him a 50-50 choice. Can't find anything wrong with the guy. Would you want us to release this criminal Barabbas, or would you want us to release this Rabbi Jesus? And they say, give us Barabbas, crucify Jesus. And Jesus is led to the cross. He lays down his life for you and I. It's the atoning sacrifice that is amazing. And what I love is at the end of these trials, there is a verdict given at the cross. Chapter 27 of the book of Matthew, verse 24, when the centurion and those with him were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened there, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely this was the Son of God. We have been trying truth this entire time, and here we stand at rock bottom. We have gotten to the root of the argument, and we're discovering he's true. Truly, this was the Son of God. If you're not a Christian, dive into your faith. Dive into this Jesus of ours. I promise you. Some were taught that you can't ask hard questions in church because it's viewed as rebellion or whatever. The problem is we don't know how to help facilitate a faith crisis. And so people hit this wall and they don't know what to do in a season where they have questions and they're doubting and they're trying to reconcile their psychology with their theology. And the church for years has pushed those people outside the community because we're intimidated of the conversation. And Paul's like, yeah, there's no reason to be intimidated. You won't find a single individual in Scripture who didn't go through a faith crisis. And we as a church will end up a shallow kiddie pool if we don't learn to help navigate and help facilitate for other people a faith crisis. You hit this wall and you discover, wait a second, there's logic and truth and reasoning and rationale and brilliance behind this life with Christ. And he's my only option. See, that's the thing. Paul comes to these 3 groups and he says, all 3 of you, the one thing that you have in common is Jesus is your only option. That's what I would bet my life on. That's a die for belief for me. I don't have many, less than 10. That's a die for belief. Jesus is your only option. And he completely levels the playing field for a community of people that is divided. And I just wonder how God might just quicken us where we are falling into the religious treadmill of going through the motions and operating beneath the veneer where we need to begin integrating our faith. And once we break through this wall, suddenly it starts to pour out of our life in a genuine, authentic, non-forced, just effortless way that God does it from the inside out, in you and through you. Amen? It's a lot of information. Here's what I'll say. As we close, I need you to hang tight with me for 5 minutes. One thing that has been a prayer for me is the priestly prayer that Jesus prayed. And his prayer was, Lord, would you make them one? And that's been my prayer for the church at large. That's certainly been my prayer for the church in America. And that would even be my prayer for our church. Folks, I was disappointed this last week by things that I seen online from individuals who call themselves followers of Christ, just not representing our God well and creating hurt and pain from all sides within our church. And my prayer is, despite the times we live in and the things that we're facing, no, we live anchored to the cross, anchored to the good news of Jesus Christ, and we recognize we're all on level playing field pursuing this Christ. Amen.